Welcome to the third edition of Insights. This is an endeavor by all of us at Ideas Consulting Group, where we try to make complex concepts simple so that they can be used by all of us at work and in life in general. Today, we are going to talk about concepts pertaining to behavioral economics and neurosciences, which also have some work to be done with artificial intelligence and machine learning. But before that, and before I introduce our two experts today, at Ideas Consulting Group, we have always believed that any business is about human motivation. Come to think of it, customers, human beings, if they are motivated, it helps the business. Employees, human beings, if they are motivated, it helps the business. Others in the business ecosystem, if they are motivated, it helps the business. And policymakers, if they are motivated, it helps the business. So if human motivation is in your favor, the chances of your business growing profitably is higher. So the question arises, what do we mean by the word motivation? And in all these training programs that we conduct, we have found all of us have our own interpretation to the word motivation. The one which we use is very simple. Motivation is the reason that any one of us give to ourselves to perform and act. And this reason could be given consciously, subconsciously, or unconsciously, because this leads us to behave or act in a particular manner. And that is why all of us would remember that in these murder mysteries, the detective first tries to ascertain the motive behind the murder. What was the reason for the murderer to commit the crime? So therefore, motivation influences behavior. Agreed. All of us have been a part and have experienced this chaos that the entire world is going through. And that has definitely impacted human behavior. I jokingly say that what our parents and teachers at school could not make us do, which was to wash our hands before eating anything, that behavioral change was forced by the virus. But ultimately, we changed behavior. The point is, if human behavior is so important, and today in the context where we are talking about work from home, a lot of organizations have right-sized their teams, and therefore, and the business dynamics have changed. So the people who exist, are they fitting to the role as they should? Sales teams are really working hard to meet sales numbers, and the business is difficult. So therefore, the idea is that behavior, human behavior is so important and is such an important ingredient for success in business. I have a question which I want to ask because this is inspired by something which I read from Peter Drucker. He says that if you can't measure, you cannot improve it. And you cannot manage what you cannot measure. Interesting. If you cannot measure, you cannot improve it. If you cannot manage, what you cannot measure. So therefore, the question that we are asking is, can human behavior be measured quantifiably? Question number one. Question number two, can human behavior be influenced in a manner that it motivates the individual to perform better in whatever role the person is? To answer these two questions and many more, I have got two extremely knowledgeable, experienced individuals, both of whom have been much more familiar than I am in concepts of behavioral economics and the application of behavioral economics in real life situation for improving performance. Mr. Ramesh Srinivas is an alumnus of IIT Madras and IIM Ahmedabad. And he has had an extremely distinguished career as a consultant, and his last corporate role was that of head of consulting practice at KPMG in India. and he has consulted with many organizations in India and abroad across different industries. Someday he decided that he will work on this aspect of human behavior and motivation, and he is the founder director along with some of his ex-colleagues of WorkZogo. WorkZogo is a very unique tool which is used for influencing and improving productivity of teams. Ramesh will delve a lot into his experience as a consultant as well as founder of WorkZogo to sort of demystify a lot of concepts that we have about behavioral economics and its application. And the other gentleman on our panel is actually a trained behavioral economist. He did his master's in behavioral economics from Stanford University after his graduation from IIT Kharagpur, and he has worked for the World Bank, the bank as he says, for nearly 2 decades before he also decided that he should do something, and he is the founder of EcoDev Solutions, and he works a lot on influencing, measuring and influencing human behavior. Let me begin with you, Subrata. I have studied economics in various stages in life and somehow barely managed to ensure that I didn't have a red mark on my report card. I mean, what is this essential difference between behavioral economics and the economics that most of you may have heard, read, studied? Let's begin with that.
Yes, good afternoon. Good afternoon to you all. It's a real pleasure. And it's always, wonderful to be with Deepak. Today's topic is of quite interesting, not just from topical issues, but also I have been into this for quite some time. Now, the major difference, or let me put it in this way, if you look at a traditional traditional economics, where we deal with what we call homo economicus. That means the people has to be the rational, logic-driven individuals, and they make certain decisions the way it should be. And that's what economics is all about. But in reality, what we found, actually human behaves completely different. Most of the times we are less rational, not always stable, and very often selfish. So all these things actually contradicts the very basic fundamentals of conventional economics. Okay? So the behavioral economics actually deals with that. So there was a dearth of a tool to manage these kind of things, that, as I was telling you, rational behaviors, not so stable behaviors, doing some things which you are not supposed to do. So how do you really deal that one? Traditional economics used to tell it as a kind of aberrations, but then we realized with the advent of mathematics, computational science, and all, so we realized that is it probably possible to really deal this animal called irrationality. Now, interestingly, our irrational behaviors, so-called irrational behaviors, are actually not illogical. They're also not senseless. Actually, most of our irrational behaviors are very systematic and greatly predictable. So as soon as these two things coming in, then becomes much easier to really handle. So that's the kind of a fundamental difference between behavior and behavioral economics and economics. So behavioral economics is actually deviation from a rational choice decision making, which we used to do it in conventional economics.
Ramesh, after you decided that you will give up consulting and do something interesting in this area, I know you went to the US and spent some time there. And if you could take the audience through what were the different triggers which sort of motivated you towards the development of what you are currently marketing as well.
Yeah, thanks, Deepak. And afternoon, everyone. So in corporate life, I think there is this strange paradox in that all of us recognize that, and everybody says it in one form or the other, that people are our most important assets. And as a consultant for Mayo for a couple of decades, I did a lot of work with a lot of large companies around transformation. And the playbook is fairly standard for this. You look at what the current processes of a company are, you streamline, tighten up those processes. And over the last 15 years, you throw a lot of technology behind it. And you say, now that I've standardized everything, everything should work fine. And therefore, I should get X benefit, which you estimate. And then you get conservative and say, even if we get half of this, it's great. But in practice, what you actually get out of it is less than half of what you conservatively estimated. And interestingly, and all of us, I'm sure, are around this discussion, have all been through this in some form or the other. The point of failure is almost never the process. Point of failure is never the technology. It's always the people. It's the people that's the point of failure. And we call it by various names. We say people are not adopting the new thing, or they are not willing to change. And so there was this whole area of change management that came into being, all of which is tweaked to say, how can we change people, right? So interestingly, we found that there is no way that there is no organized mechanism that people have looked at on a consistent basis to say, how can we look at changing the behaviors of people in a positive way so that they achieve outcomes that are beneficial to them? And logically, if outcomes are beneficial to every individual, the organization benefits as well, right? I'll take an example from personal life for all of us. And to be honest, 15 years ago, I used to be a skeptic on this. I used to be a skeptic because I used to say, it's all about, and a background, all engineers who come from an engineering background tend to look at problems from a very rational, analytical standpoint and say, if it's rational, analytical, it should work, right? I mean, what's the reason that it doesn't work? But like Subrata said, all of us are irrational. And I'll take an example from our personal lives. We are in March, and I'm certain in Jan of this year, all of us had, in some form or fashion, we had at least one resolution that pertained to improving our physical well-being. Whether it was diet, exercise, yoga, meditation, walking, running, it's immaterial. I'm certain all of us had at least one, right? If not more than one that said, this year, I'll be a lot more disciplined about doing this. We are mid to end March, and I'm fairly sure that what we are achieving right now is below what we wanted to achieve 2.5 months ago, right? The reason if we think about it has nothing to do with lack of information. All of us have enough basic knowledge, information about how much to exercise, how much to walk, what to eat, what not to eat, whether yoga is beneficial or meditation and so on. So knowledge is not the limiting factor. It's not even, a motivation to it, because all of us have set this resolution, so it's not. What is the limiting factor is to get ourselves to do it on a day-to-day basis, right? We all do it, but we do it far less frequently than we'd like to. So this is, again, in corporate life, what do? We say, look, let's give more and more information, because then people will perform better and better. But it's like diet or exercise. More and more information does not lead to action. So what is it that leads to actual action? Because action is what produces results. I mean, an intention to do it doesn't produce results. But how do you get that day-to-day action is really the key. And it's not about saying, can we kind of train someone or motivate someone once every 6 months and do it and get that done. It's about saying, how do you do it on a daily basis? Interestingly, a lot of studies around behavioral economics have thrown up some fascinating paradoxes, which I think all of us have been late to adopt in our work environment. So I'll take one as a quick example before I pass it back to Deepak. But the very common mechanism for us to get people motivated is incentive. So the theory is, let's incentivize, and like Deepak said, right? Drucker said, you measure it, then you incentivize it, you'll get greater performance out of it, right? And it all seems great. There was a very interesting thing that happened in Tel Aviv in Israel. There were a bunch of creches. There were about 10 creches there. And, parents had to come and pick up their children at 4 p.m. every day. And if you didn't pick up at 4 p.m., some teacher or the other had to wait. And therefore, you felt a little embarrassed about making somebody wait. So the latecomers were very few and far between, but nevertheless, they were there. There would always be the odd parent who'd come at 4:30, pick up the child and go, and be very embarrassed about it. So someone came up with this idea saying, listen, and I'm sure some of us do this even for meetings. They said, listen, why don't we levy a fine on people who come late, right? So you say, okay, if you come late by half an hour, it costs you X dollars. 1 hour, so many dollars. And so they, out of the 10, they picked 6 creches and said, let's levy the fine. And, at least, surprisingly, the number of latecomers doubled. In all those where there was a fine, it doubled. And in the others, it stayed the same. And the reason they found was that people now said, I'm paying money for it, so it's a service. Whereas earlier you felt guilty that you made somebody wait, right? So you always felt awkward. You made some teacher wait, so you felt very guilty and said, I won't do this again because I can't face this teacher if I do this on a regular basis. So you try and make sure that you come on time. But now that you're paying for it, you say it's a service. I'm paying for it, so there's no guilt whatsoever. So incentive actually degraded performance. If you look at performance as number of parents coming on time. So there are a lot of interesting experiments around like this, and there are other applications we'll talk about as we kind of go through. But Deepak, that's a long answer to a short question.
I could not have related more to the 1st January resolution, which I've been taking for many years. And that's always when I'm at my peak on 31st night at the parties. And invariably, 1st January, last night I had a party, we'll start it from tomorrow. And I'm reminded about Oscar Wilde, who had once said, why should I postpone something to tomorrow, which I can possibly do day after? And I think that has been my motivation throughout. So, you have been fortunate to have had Dr. Richard Thaler, who was the Nobel Prize winner in 2017 as a professor in Stanford University. I'm sure, like Ramesh gave the example about the Tel Aviv crash case, you will have a lot of interesting case studies which actually sort of demonstrates the application of the concepts which behavioral economics is the foundation of behavioral economics. A few of them, please.
Yeah, it's as Ramesh was mentioning, I mean, it's actually questioning the dominant paradigm and actually shaken these whole ideas of theory and kind of. I would like to give one example, which is actually the kind of work I used to do in the bank. One of the greatest challenge in a large organization like World Bank, which is primarily, work with the country governments. So our clients are primarily country governments. We had a private sector wing through which we also work with a large private sector company, but it's primarily government. Now, one of the major challenges that always seems to come in front of us that how do you really incentivize? Same thing. How do you really incentivize for good work? Kind of say for example, what of the work I was getting involved in that? Will people pay for cleaner air? Will people pay for better environment? Because all studies shows that if the air is clean, pollution is gone, life expectancy gone up, you have a better life and all. But at the end of the day, who will pay for that? Is anybody pay for that? So we started a program called Payment for Ecosystem Services. Now, it's very interesting. When we started Payment for Ecosystem Services, now everybody was on board with us. They're talking about, yes, it should be paid and all. But when it comes to who will bail the cat, then they'll know, no, we should not do it because we are a least developed country. We should not do it, we're a developed country. All these kind of things coming up. So the question comes, so those days we used, today it sounds a little bit rudimentary, but those days it was a quite sophisticated tool. We used a willingness to pay principle, that who are willing to really pay for these services and all. And we had phenomenal experiences, kind of, one such experience I just wanted to narrate very quickly. It was like this experiment we has done in Indonesia. Now, what we found, and this is true for almost every country, it's a mountain ecosystem, So what we found that most of, the denudation is taking place. The trees are, people are cutting trees and all at the upstream. And for that, there's a huge amount of soil erosion taking place, and the people on the downstream are getting getting affected by that. Now, the question is that how do you really do it? How can you tell these, people to really? So we had a long, so the methodology what we developed is that we call that rewarding upland farmers for the benefit being accrued by the lowland farmers. So the lowland farmers, what are the benefits they are getting? Some of the benefit is passed on to the upland farmers, and that in turn motivate them to really conserve the nature. So it's, I'm putting it in a simple way. So it's a complicated way of, putting this calculation in place and all. But today, when I look back into that research, but I found that, probably those days we haven't really put that rigor of behavioral economics so much. but it's a clearing case of how do you quantify some irrational behaviors and thereby design a system by which you can actually, institutionalize behavior change. Now, why behavior change is so important? Kind of in the context of, if you look at business today, if you look at, see, one is obviously, if you have, we always look at business, behavior change, but primarily because it leads to effective decisions. See, end of the day, behavior change or anything related to behavior, as Ramesh mentioned, implication is on the decision making side. That, so effective decision making is more important rather than the right decision making. And classical economics always talk about right decisions, but today we talk about no, it has to be effective decisions. A second is also behavioral economics, that if you do a behavior change, it helps you to do a better intervention, better implementation. I mean, take the case of sales guys, and how do you, if you can influence his ability to take decisions and the quality of decisions, then the intervention become better. So that's why behavior change or behavioral economics that way related to decision making. So it's called decision making science. So that's a kind of a thing we used to do in bank. But when coming out of the bank, we started applying it to more into the business and enterprises, kind of.
Excellent. Subrato, I'll just go to Ramesh. Ramesh, Subrato spoke about the sales teams and sort of getting them to decide better, take the effective action right rather than the right action. I mean, your thoughts on this and your experience with Workzone on this?
Yeah, actually, it's a good point that Subrato said. So I'll go back to that same thing, right? That the theory that we tend to use in a lot of corporate environments is the more data you give, the better someone will do. But it also has a flip side, and that flip side is you're taking away a little bit of autonomy from me. Like, let's say I'm a salesperson. By micromanaging me, you're taking away some autonomy from me. And I mean, like we all said, we are human beings, right? We'd also like to believe that we know to a fair extent, and we should have the freedom to take decisions on what to do. And we are capable of working things out for ourselves, which will therefore be much more effective, right? Regardless of what a technology or an analytics software is. Now, this again links to a number of different interesting behaviors. So here's an interesting experiment we did, right? The typical incentive program that you have for salespeople says, if you achieve, let's say, hit 90% of your target, you get some incentive. You achieve 100, you get so much, 110, and so on. There is an incentive that you get if you achieve a target. And that's a known thing. So everybody, I mean, most people will strive to get it. Interestingly, we looked at it and said, there is this behavioral, it's called a heuristic or a bias, which is called loss aversion. That says that I get pained if I lose 1,000 rupees far more than I get happy if I gain 1,000 rupees. So the loss hurts me much more than a gain makes me happy, right? And it's a common one that's there. A lot of people are supposed to have it. So we said, let's test it out and see. I mean, let's test it in a sales concept. Does it really work? So we took a large number, about I think 150, 200 salespeople in each two categories. And 25th of the month, we looked at people who were near about achieving their sales incentive, getting close. And so to one group, we told them through our application, I mean, you can send nudges on our product. So we sent it saying, listen, you have only 6 days to go. If you push yourself by so much, you'll earn 2,000 rupees more, right? So that's one thing that you can do. You have potential to earn 2,000 more. And to the other group, we said, you have only 6 days to go. If you go at your current rate, you'll lose 2,000 rupees. Right? It's actually the same number at the end of the day. It's saying I'm going to gain, whereas the other group is saying you always got, let's say, 12,000 rupees incentive, you'll only get 10,000, right? To this group, it's saying you're at 10, you'll get 12 if you go. So it's the same number. There's no difference between the two. That's how we picked, cohorts that were identical. Interestingly, the group where we said you will lose picked up substantially higher than the group that we said you will gain. Now it's the same amount. It's the same 2,000 rupees. It's the same period of the month. They're at the same level of performance. Logically or rationally speaking, gaining 2,000 rupees from 10 to 12 is the same as losing from 12 to 10 if I don't. There's no difference between them, right? But there's significantly higher performance in here. So this is what I think Subrato was talking about, right? We believe that we are all highly rational, but in day-to-day things, and I'm sure all of us, we sit back and think about our day-to-day lives, what we do. Why do we postpone doing certain things? Why do we do certain things we don't need to? All of us are fundamentally rational. But interestingly, it's possible to tweak that in a positive way. So if you're able to use these inherent irrationalities that we have in a positive way, we'll all gain as a result. So that's one example of how you can use principles of behavioral science to positively impact people.
In fact, Ramesh, I remember when I used to work for organizations, I have found people, somebody who's got $1,000 increment is unhappy because somebody who he thinks is inferior has also got 300 rupees increment. Why? I mean, I have got 1,000, I'm not happy about it. Why has he got 300? I'm unhappy about it. This is a very classical phenomenon. I'm sure all of us have seen that work. Shubhra, you had a very interesting story about retailers in Africa. Some work which you did for the bank, and you measured few things quantifiably, where you collaborated with some of the top universities in the world. Can you briefly talk about that experiment?
Yeah, right. That's an interesting action research we actually undertaken on the behest of US government. Now, that's a very interesting problem in front of us. So we are working with large multinational companies, and they have, the current market share is around $4 million, in that particular country. It's country called Senegal in the West Africa. Now, the potential is to actually double the business. But the challenge what they are having, that most of their proxy sales force, like the dealer, distributor, retailers, they're all non-exclusive in nature. That means they are also entitled to sell competitors' product. Okay. Now, for this company, competitors' product is not a problem. For this company, the problem was the local products, which are by far very inferior in quality and all this. So they are telling, look, we are selling a technology, whereas somebody come and really, selling something which is awful of a product. And by that way, we are not only losing income, money, and we are also, our brand is eroding. So what to do exactly? So then they thought that, look, probably we should have get a group of people who value for quality, who will not cut short, cut the corners, probably would be more loyal to us and all. Now, all these are intangibles, So the management was thinking that, look, it is good, but, how do we find it? Now, most of the time, they find these kind of people based on long associations, because many of the people are working with them for donkey's years, and they tell, yeah, I know that John is good because I know him for last 8 years. That Peter is not so good because, I don't know, I just know him for 1 year. He may be good, he may not be good, I don't know. So all these, then, the question comes that, is it possible to really measure that quantitatively? And that's the fundamental part of the research. So what we had done, we looked into 700 such micro retailers. They're really small business owners, spread across entire, country, Senegal. And first of all, we try to really understand that what makes them a business person. Why are you calling them a business person? And it's a more of a typological problem. So we like to understand, first of all, define how do you tell a person, or how do you brand a person as an entrepreneur or a business person? Now, we were a bit fortunate because we were collaborating with 3 large universities, for this part of the project: Cambridge in the UK, MIT and the Yale in the US. And then first things what we had done, we find out a kind of a, primarily based on secondary researches, the definition of an entrepreneur. And interestingly, the definitions are all intangible quality. Like an entrepreneur will have as you mentioned, a highly motivated guy. He should have strong Excel, drive to excel. He should have a strong networking capability, have an eye for detail, and all these things. And now the point coming in that, okay, how do you really measure it? And so that's what our first the tool came up. So where we use primary behavior data. We designed the instrument through which we collect primary behavior data. And at the back end, we run an algorithm which actually converts that primary behavior data into tangible scores. And, so now because it's scores is easy to handle. And based on that, we actually, classify people into 3 cohorts. The people, we measure primarily 2 things. One is we measure his ability to generate revenue, which we call entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial capability. Second one, we measure his willingness to repay, because many of them, they need working capital loan, they need kind of things. But then how do you know that he or she will repay? And most of these guys, they doesn't have a strong financial history, so that you cannot run a normal credit score kind of things. So when we measure based on these two, we actually found three set of people. Some who are very high on these two indices, we call them champion, and who are very low, we call rookie, and the masters are in between. And then we triangulate it with the existing data point, try to really see how accurate we are in terms of predicting these things. So our, the match came around 88 to 90%. I mean, as a first instance, is a pretty good actually. We look into, and then we deployed into various other countries, various other situations, and all. And through this research, what we found, primarily there are 12 traits, behavior traits we identified, which actually tells us this, how entrepreneurial creditworthy they are. They are something like achievement motivation, locus of control, passion for work, metacognition, self-efficacy, need for dominance, and also the networking capability, and then conscientiousness, agreeableness, extraversion, neuroticism, openness to ideas, and all these. And so what we had done, we measured each of the traits individually, but then we found that there is also relationship between these traits, and that's why mathematics comes in, the computation science comes in. So that combination of these, the function of all these, that gives us a much better insight, and that's become a kind of a so going forward, we have been used it for quite some time now. I mean, we deployed it around 12 countries. No, I think now it's 14 countries. We are now very recently we are in Australia and in Europe. So that's what we are currently trying to do, where mathematically we measure behavior, and thereby their ability to take decisions.
In fact, Subrata, you bring a very interesting point, which I want Ramesh to comment upon. Ramesh, on your WorkZogo platform, briefly, you could just explain to the audience how does the platform basically work. But what I'm interested and requesting you to comment on is there a lot of behavior that you can observe on this platform, and some of the insights which you are able to cull out for the organizations which are using WorkZogo, both at the frontline salesman and supervisory level, would be very interesting for the audience.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just give a brief about what a concept is, and there's not a sales pitch. It's more to explain and say how do we use behavior. But fundamentally, we have a mobile product. And what the mobile product does is it nudges salespeople on a daily basis, but uses behavioral nudges in terms of telling them what to do on a day-to-day basis. So it uses a number of different types of behavioral nudges. Interestingly, if all of us think about people in large organizations, and let's say I'm a salesperson, actually the organization has a lot of potential to collect, to know or understand me very well, because number one, all my performance information is somewhere. Constantly I'm being mentored, coached, told to do things by managers, etc. And I have a certain response. So on a daily basis, strictly speaking, there's a lot of interaction that takes place. If you make some of that interaction digital by saying some of this coaching, suggestion on what to do, mentoring, if you can make it digital, then interestingly, you can capture the impact of that coaching on my performance as well, because then it's easy correlation, right? So that's what we do in a nutshell. We do digital coaching by sending nudges through our platform, and then try and track what impact it has had on my performance, which things I respond to, which ones I don't, how much I've improved, how much I haven't, etc. And therefore, in some sense, there is a digital coach for me, personal coach, which begins to understand me very well and says, okay, this is what this person responds to. So let's do this in order to up my own performance, right? It benefits me. So that's a concept. Now, the result of this, interestingly, if you aggregate it, you can get a lot of very interesting behavioral patterns that there is no other way of collecting. So let me give one example. We did this for a very, very large bank, and this had a few thousands of salespeople that we were doing it for. And the head of the bank called us at the end of a year and said, listen, you people gather a lot of data. You obviously understand as a result of this aggregate data what makes my salespeople tick? So can I look at incentive structures, etc., that are in line with what actually makes them tick? And so we did this analysis, and we did for two large groups. One group large worked entirely in the tier 3, tier 4 rural areas of the country. And they were headed by a certain person. Another group worked largely in the urban areas. They sold slightly different products naturally because of the geography, but one was largely rural, tier 3, tier 4 town focused, one was urban focused. And so when we kind of did the aggregate analysis, one very interesting pattern came up. Now, if you look at behavior or what motivates, let's say me, I get motivated by a number of things, incentive, comparison with my peers, etc. But at an aggregate level, I can break it into two things. Am I motivated by comparison with others? Meaning, do I reference myself with my peers, or do I reference myself? I say last quarter I got so much, now I should get more, right? So two broad areas. And interestingly, we found that the rural team was almost entirely self-referencing, and the urban team was peer referencing, right? Same bank, the head of both of these was the same individual. So same incentive structure, everything the same, but two very different behavior patterns. This was the data, this is what it showed. So we presented it and said, we have no idea why, but this is what the data says. And so he looked and said, intuitively, I agree with this. And he said, the kind of people we take for our rural operations very often are people who come from much smaller towns. In many cases, they are amongst the few people in their social circle that have a job with a large corporate. So they aren't concerned about, am I doing better than my neighbor? They are more concerned about saying, can I increase my social circle? Can I get more people involved, right? And therefore make it better for my either village or rural area and get everybody up. Whereas the urban people sit in an office, there's chatter about who else is doing what. So there it's about saying, I've got, and like Deepak said, right, I've got 1,000, but he's got 300. How did he get it, etc. So he said, I pretty much agree with the way it's now. This is very interesting. So what was even more interesting was, he said, it makes sense for me to have two different incentive structures. Yes. For the rural, it's a very simple structure that says, you achieve so much, you get so much, right? No comparison. But in the urban, I'll build a bit of competitiveness. I'll say the top 20% will go on a trip somewhere. There'll be some gold president's group for the top 10%, etc. Because that's what people want to strive. They are not happy with saying I'm doing better, but I am doing better than my neighbor is important, right? And so you can build structures that, for whatever reason, and it's hard to change that behavior, right? But given that that behavior exists, you can build incentive structures and reward recognition structures that are in line with what they actually behave like. This is not based on a questionnaire. This is not based on people answering an instrument. This is based on tens of ways, and every individual behaves every day. We gather about 1 million behavioral instances a week across all our customers and people. So obviously there's a rich amount of data in there. So these are interesting things that you uncover when you look at saying, what are people actually doing? Just one word before I go on. We define behavior a little differently in our product. We say behavior is observed action. It's not intent. I can't measure intent. I want to go meet 5 customers today is a great intent, but our measurement of behavior is how many have I actually met? Have I met 0, 1, 2, 4 is the actual, because behavior for us is something that's strong enough to translate into action and not remain a good intention in our minds. Absolutely. And so it's that translation that becomes important. That throws up a lot of interesting, analysis variables that come along the way.
Subrata, I'm sure Professor Taylor got the Nobel for his pioneering work on the concept of nudge, which Ramesh mentioned. I'm sure you have studied, you've been taught by him. I'm sure you will have 1 or 2 case studies from Professor Taylor's work, which could be of interest to the audience.
Right. Yeah, I mean, nudge become very prominent because of him, but nudge was there also before. But he actually, started looking in this from a concept called choice, architecture. So choice architecture is one of the greatest challenges today. Is not lack of choices; is actually choice overload. Today, if you look at from a consumer point of view, any product you tell, our challenge is actually what to choose, what not to choose. I mean, maybe 40 years ago in India, you have only choice of getting only ambassador car. So you have no other choice. But today, almost every month, there is a new variant coming up. So the problem is, what not to take and what to take kind of. So nudge actually based on that choice architecture, that how do you design that, and then you push the customer to a desired choice which you really like him or her to buy, kind of things. So that's the way he's nudged. But most of his early work in nudge is actually on the public policy space. And he being a professor, and the universities are the site for generating public goods primarily, though in the US people, university produce a lot of commercial goods as well. So he's on the public policy space. So yeah, his early works are kind of, why person didn't give away their organ after death. I mean, why it's so difficult to, sound smoky, all these kind of things. There's a lot of interesting work done. I would really like to tell you two very interesting studies, one study primarily in which he was involved in, and that's a very interesting one, and it's now well read, kind of well covered also. So, this is a group of hotel, chain, JW Marriott, it's a large chain, and JW Marriott primarily offers on a franchisee basis. So many countries, they don't have own property, but is run by the franchise. Now, it was in the early 2014. JW Marriott was actually, as a group, like to improve their carbon footprint. So as a hospitality industry, the wastage is very high. Most of their processes are not so green. So shareholders are putting a lot of pressure on them and telling that, look, we need to be more sensitive. So one of the areas they identified is a very interesting area that they found that during a buffet lunch or dinner across the globe, and this I'm talking about across various countries' data, they found that food wastage is remarkably high, very high. In fact, the data shows around 48% foods are being wasted during the buffet lunch or dinner. Now, almost half of the food actually going to the drain. Now, financially or commercially, it is not hitting them because anyway, customer pays for it. So they're not bothered, but they are bothered because these food wastage, there are growing sensitivity across the globe that, you should not waste food. And they always equate the food wastage with number of hungry mouths, So had not been wasted, so many people could have fed kind of. So they told how to really stop that. And it's a very, very tricky situation, normal classical thinking just ceased to operate, you cannot, in a hospitality industry particularly, you cannot go and tell your guests, don't eat, don't waste, do this, do that. No way. Strict no. And the line managers are, they are literally never ever, you can't do that. You are actually committing suicide. So they, hired, Dr. Thaler and his team and all. And it's a very multidisciplinary team. It's not just only economists, there are designers and all these product designers and all. They come up with a very interesting idea. And what they had done, they actually reduced the size of the dinner plate by almost half. So people are thinking, what is the heck? How is it going to change? So 2018, they took the survey again. So they found that food wastage has actually reduced by 30%. That means current food wastage is now only 18%. So from 48 to 18%, just doing a simple, solution called reducing your plate size, the dinner plate size. Now, this is the, classical example of nudge, where you are actually changing somebody's behavior without letting him or her know, and that's also put a serious question about classical training, paradigm, the way people do training on behavior change and all these, So because, as you all do training, in your organizations, or you have seen that the return on investment on training is not always been properly measured, is a very expensive propositions and all. So this is a classical case of nudge theory where, and this particular case, nudge is not a process, just a product. So nudge could be both process and the product. So there are various such examples are there across, and we do use these kind of things also in our work quite often.
So Subrata, is it because people feel shy to go up every time and get the food, therefore the wastage reduced? What was the behavior?
The fundamental reason, so they have videographies. They have videographies, the videographic evidence where they're analyzing. Three things actually happen. See, number one, when people go in a typical, and it's not restricted to India, it's almost everywhere in the world, that people try to take as much as food is possible. It's almost like mini, Mount Everest on your plate. And the primary reason is that people is not greedy. Primary reason is, as what Ramesh was mentioning, it's a certain bias that works. Bias is that what is my chance or probability of going back to the queue and getting my second help? So better I would really like to optimize, in this particular case, maximize my serving, so that even if I miss one queue, doesn't matter, I have enough food on my plate. But there is no mechanism to really calculate quantitatively how hungry I am. It's a perception based. So many a times they landed up with more food which they are not intended. Now, as soon as you reduce plate size, a couple of things happen. Now, number one, obviously you are not, so that particular bias is questioned. So challenge. As soon as your bias is challenged, as a human being, as a human behavior, you try to find out another mechanism. So what is the mechanism? So you try to really see that how quickly I can go back to the queue. Now, as soon as you quickly go back to the queue, after 2 or 3 times you do, there's a lot of eyeball pressure. People all looking at you and started telling, these are all done in a very subtle way. Nobody will come and tell you why are you going to do that. And it actually started affecting your behavior, So these are the way, even so based on that, so the fundamental reason is that you work on the biases. And if you can develop certain solutions that will challenge that biases, people will automatically, it's a kind of an autopilot mode, kind of automatically adjust themselves to any behavior.
Ramesh, my experience, 33 years since I have graduated from IMC, is that the most difficult position in any organizational structure is the first line supervisor. If that first line supervisor is unable to do his or her supervisory role, then the team actually doesn't perform to the potential. Now, the work that you do in WorkZogo, you are getting so much information and data and behavioral instances which you mentioned more than 1 million in a week. Does it also give insights to this frontline supervisor to perform his or her duties more effectively?
Yeah, good question, Deepak. Actually, you're right. If you look at a frontline supervisor, in a lot of cases, they handle depending on the company structure, 5 to 8 people at any rate. That's our usual size that you see across the board. So it's actually a difficult job because many of them actually are not trained before they get into that role in the first place. Second, there's a lot of information they have to assimilate before they are able to coach every single individual. So if you're able to use technology intelligently to do 2 things. Number one, curate all that information because it's an overload. If I have 8 people working under me, each of the 8, how are they doing is an information overload. So first, if you're able to use technology intelligently to curate that information and give it to the supervisor in terms of which person is doing well in what, which person needs help in which area, who requires a little more support because of consistent struggling to do something, then it helps me narrow my attention down into people where I can actually add value, right? Also, if I'm then told how to kind of handle each one more effectively, depending on their behavior patterns, it gets much easier for me because at the end, there has to be a human touch. And we can use a product, software and do as much as we want, but there is a human touch that's required. So if you're able to combine these 2, then obviously it gets much more effective in terms of, number one, the mentoring that they can do. Second, also increasing their span of control as a result, right? Both you can do as a result of doing this.
So therefore, Ramesh, you will be able to sort of basket the team members as well as supervisors into different categories based on the behavior.
Yeah, we do, but it's not about saying good or bad. It's about saying this is what they are like. So how do you therefore use their strengths to get them to do better is the core concept. Correct. It's not about managing. It's about saying this is what an individual strength is. Use it more to get them to do better, right? And that's the core idea behind actually, Subrato made an important point that the nudge is very subtle. It's very implicit, like reducing the size of the plate. There's no notice that says, please don't waste food. Right? Hey, you just reduce the size of the plate, it happens. Incidentally, we are all subjected to this in a lot of our personal lives and consumer products we interact with digital without even realizing it. So I'll give you a quick example. All of us I'm certain, are on LinkedIn. 4 or 5 years ago in LinkedIn gets more effective if it gathers more data about us. The only way it can gather more data is for us to fill our profile effectively, right? So we have to fill qualification, etc., what we did, etc. Now, early days, obviously, it was sketchy because we all saw it as just saying, okay, it's a means of connecting with people. So they put a very small bar on top. And I think all of us have used to see that bar. That said, your profile is only 37%. Fill up your degree, it will become 52%, right? And so one thing, it asked you to, so you went filled up, it became 52, you're very happy. It didn't tell you fill up your whole profile, otherwise you can't go further, you're not allowed. All of us would have walked out of that product, right? So this is a nudge. It got us to do it. It made us feel good that we got that done because this thing went up and they got what they wanted as well, right? So that is another example of a digital nudge. And what Subrato gave was a physical nudge. This is a digital nudge. And all of us, by the way, are subject. You go to Amazon, and if you start looking for it, you'll see a lot of digital nudges. You will see when you buy a certain product, it will say only 5 left in stock, right? That's a behavioral thing called scarcity. I don't want to lose only 5 are there, right? In fact, when Flipkart did that mobile phones thing, right, they had that thing saying, it's open for 1 minute, please go and book. And you had whatever, a few 100,000 that went in and booked for a mobile phone in 1 minute. And it's strange, right? You want it more when it is scarce. But a lot of digital products use this. It's not unfamiliar if we open our minds and think about it.
Yeah, in fact, Subrata, the point that you were making about this experiment that you did in Senegal, I often hear, especially when we consult with a lot of these family-run businesses, the owner says, I want my employees to have an entrepreneurial mindset. They should act and behave like entrepreneurs. Am I right? So I'm sure the work that you have done with those 12 behavioral traits is also applicable for employees in different job roles with different needs.
Yes.
So and how does it work?
Yeah, so it started with a particular job role called, as I told you, retailers or dealers. And then going forward, we realized that, it has a great potential if we can really tailor it to a different situations, and more issues are we started getting major. Like I'll give an example, we started with entrepreneurial capability and creditworthiness. Today we have added 2 more. One more thing, one of them is called trainability. Means ability to adopt or apply acquired knowledge. Now you might have gone through training and all. You have all seen. See, training program, people come, learn, but that does not necessarily mean as soon as they go back to their workspace or in life, they will started applying it immediately. That never happens that way. So then why? So we started measuring that one. Second thing, so we also started measuring what we call resilience, and it is becoming very, very important in this particular context of pandemic. We were in conversation with a large refinancing bank. Now they were telling, it's a very interesting story. They were telling that, look, government is asking us to recapitalize all these businesses, because everybody lost their working capital, everybody lost everything, but we really don't have any data. We really don't know because last 1 year they haven't done any transaction. So how do we really make a decision to that? So what we are trying here, we are trying to really measure something called resilience. Resilience means one's ability to cope in a stressful situation. Now, these are all behavior factors. These are, yes, there is some economic factors attached to it, but it's primarily to do this. Now, I have my own work also, on a research, where we are actually looking at which group of farmer will adopt climate smart agriculture technologies faster than others. So what and as Ramesh mentioned, it's not that, you give them information, you give them technology, you give them incentive and immediately they will lap it up. No. What we found, and not in one country, it's across country, research in, I think in 4 countries. And we found that the more the resilient farmer, and they actually adopt the climate smart, or that matter, any solution much faster than others. So from these, we started also helping organizations, which is called How do you know that business continuity is followed? How do you know that person will continue his or her business in a situation like pandemic? And it's very, very relevant to dealer, distributor, and all these kind of small business who are not on the payroll of a company, but constitutes a very important element into their entire thing. So yes, we started doing it. So what we do, what we call benchmarking process. We benchmark that particular job role, and then we try to find out that in order to excel or in order to deliver certain things, what are the behavioral attributes required for him or her? And then at the back end, we customize that one. And then
Subrata, you have gone mute for whatever reason. Sorry, unmute yourself, please. I think you've got mute. Yeah, please.
Yeah, yes.
So the last portion you missed.
Yeah. So what we do then, that's what I'm telling that, we are now looking at various job profiles or job description, whatever you may call, and then we benchmark, like, that particular job, in order to perform, what are the kind of behavioral attributes they need to have. And then we collect that primary behavior data and then run this algorithm to do it. Life becomes a little bit easier now because we are using currently the machine learning algorithm. So it throws more insights currently. So that's the way we,
In fact, Subrata, I can relate to what you are saying. I'm sure all of us in organizations have seen that this guy is so good. He has all the qualities that are needed for this role. But somehow his performance is not matching the expectation. That's one thing that I have seen often. Then we find that we do headhunting. We get the best of person to the best of our ability. All types of tests done, interviews, this, that. The guy is a total misfit into the organization. So there is much more than academic credentials, experience, basic competencies, and I think behavior is the missing piece in this jigsaw, which makes that fitment, whether a person fits the role or fits it partially or doesn't fit at all. One question which has come up very interestingly from Mohua, and others, please type in your questions. And why are we adding economic with behavior and making it behavioral economics? Why can't we call it behavioral science? What is the difference between behavioral science and behavioral economics? Mohua, I think you have represented my thoughts. This is exactly the question which I posed to both the panelists.
It's interesting questions. I mean, let me put it in this way. My professor, Dr. Richard Thaler, used to tell that behavioral economics done with strong injection of good psychology. Okay, what does it mean? See, psychology or behavior science talks about what is the behavior per se, and full stop. It really doesn't take it along that what is the implication on a application side. It can be business, it can be day-to-day things, it can be. I just give a small example. If you take this example of the program of Swachh Bharat, for example, okay, Swachh Bharat aims at what? That behavioral application of behavioral science to tell people that the needfulness of making clean and the hygiene. Okay, and to be maintained, that's what their role ends. But the question is, who will do it? Now, as soon as behavioral economics comes in, then the whole industry spring up. Now, I don't have the data in handy, but I read somewhere, exact figure I don't know now, but that because of the Swachh Bharat, the entire sanitation related industry in India has gone couple of fold. Now, that's where the economics part comes in. Because you use behavior as an input to really institutionalize certain things.
In fact, before Ramesh speaks, Subrata, I read somewhere, some economist from Princeton, he made a very pertinent point. He says that economists today are so mathematically driven to prove their whatever concept they have through mathematics. He said that building toilets alone won't make people to go and use the toilets. So I think there is need of a social behavioral change, which unless done will not have that loop totally completed the way the entire initiative or the objective of the program is. Ramesh, your thoughts on behavioral science versus behavioral economics?
Yeah, actually, it's a good question. And I would think actually the original application of this whole behavioral thing came through our behavior in an economic context. And therefore, the phrase behavioral economics that said classical economics assumes all of us are very rational, we all behave the same way, all of us respond to the same incentives, etc., and the same triggers. And behavioral economics said is not true. All of us don't respond to the same. We are also not very rational. We also don't necessarily measure of utility of something before we actually do it. And so I guess the phrase came there. But there's always been a branch which I think we used to call psychology, which still is, which is behavioral science, which looked at saying, can you look at adding statistical scientific methods also to extrapolate behavior patterns to a wider population. So I guess that's all it is.
In fact, Kahneman was awarded the Nobel Prize for his work on behavioral economics, right? 2002.
Yeah.
The first Nobel on behavioral economics, but his work is a very seminal because first time he actually challenged all of us to look, use psychology as one of the lever,
In fact, I've been reading that book, Think Slow, Think Fast. It's amazing. And it's based on observing people and then trying to interpret what he observed. Very interesting stuff. I'm somewhere in the middle of this thing. Mohua, you've raised hand. You can ask question. How does Daniel Kahneman work fits into industrial behavior for improving the productivity of human resources? The question is from Prakash. Who will take this?
Interesting question.
Oh, I can take it. I mean, I think there are many applications of Kahneman's work in that. I think I gave one example of different kinds of sales incentive structures, right? Where you use loss aversion, where you say what you can lose if you don't do versus what you gain if you do. Also, the incentive structures around saying, do I refer myself to peers or am I self-referencing? So you have different motivational incentive structures that work. All of these are actually driven by human behavior. So if we are able to understand saying at an aggregate level or even at an individual level, what is it that motivates every individual? And that's what we do on our product through the concept of nudges. Then the final intent of that is actually to increase performance or productivity of every individual, which automatically leads to their own satisfaction going up and therefore the organization benefiting. So yes, I mean, it's widely in fact done, and we do it to that's the basis of our product.
Yeah, and actually
if you would like to add to
that lead to this, this very famous prospect theory. That's what Daniel Kahneman's major work. That theory helps us to really measure that loss aversion bias and other biases, kind of things. So it is all about the interaction between the risk and uncertainties. Now, any productivity related issue you talk about, it is very important to really understand that risk and uncertainty related to this and thereby the performance. From a theoretical standpoint, yes, it gives us a completely new way of looking into it. But on a practical way, we use the same kind of analytical tools to actually measure that risk and uncertainty and that. Right. So that's the kind of a contribution Dr. Kahneman made. One more thing what Professor Kahneman has done, because he has been able to influence, a large number of economists, to really look into these kind of things. I know, and that's the path breaking, and that's why he's considered to be guru, though his primary work is more towards psychology than towards economics. That's the kind of contribution he made.
Philip Matthew has a question. Fascinating stories, but notice most of them are related to salespeople or general social behavior. Do you have any interesting example to share involving behavior of a large manufacturing workforce?
Yeah, Philip. Hi, Ramesh. Actually, there is one. So we had a product earlier that we called an innovation management product, meaning it's essentially like your suggestion boxes or continuous Kaizen, continuous improvement thing that you do. Where digitally, of course, it's a product. So anyone on there, it's an app, so you can go in and give suggestions. And so we used to study saying what is the impact of different things that you do in terms of how actively people get engaged and involved. And we found one very interesting pattern. When people give ideas, and this holds particularly in manufacturing, because in sales, I don't think anyone comes up with ideas, but in one of these continuous improvement Kaizen things, when people give ideas, the extent to which people continue to engage and give ideas was entirely dependent not on number of their ideas that were selected, was not dependent on how many got implemented, was entirely dependent on whether they got a feedback on that idea or not within a 2-3 day period of time. So, and we broke it up into two groups. One group, there was a response within a couple of days saying it's a good idea, we are evaluating it, we'll let you know if we take it up. Also sometimes saying it's a good idea, but we don't think it's the right time to do it, or something we won't take up now. The engagement of ideas continued when feedback came. And feedback didn't come, regardless of whether that idea was taken up or not, whether acknowledged later or not, it dropped off completely. So the interesting thing appears to be that rejection of an idea is not seen as a negative. Apathy is seen as a negative, meaning somebody doesn't even respond to what it is, right? And therefore, we learned when building that product, and we've actually put it at a couple of large manufacturing companies at that time, a couple of years ago. We learned that you need to find ways to make sure that the loop, so to say, is closed for people to actually participate and engage. And there are many more examples of how to build greater engagement when you have, this continuous improvement thing going along, all of which are behavior related.
Subrat, any examples from your?
Yeah, I mean, I would really like to draw, all of your attention to a large organization per se, may not be manufacturing. I mean, one of the greatest examples, look at government today. The government across the globes are increasingly using behavioral economics. One of the greatest nudge or, a solution in this, what we call direct cash transfer. This direct cash transfer or benefit transfer to the poor people whom it really intended to. It's first experimented in Brazil. And, so these are the kind of things, actually impact large organizations. So the behavioral economics and the nudge thereafter has been applied to large organizations also, be it manufacturing, as Ramesh was mentioning, or large corporate organizations, and also the government across the board. People are really using it. So, so it actually stands the test of time. That yes, it's a discipline to stay. The solutions are actually making a lot more difference.
There is a question for me. Prakash asks, we now hear Industry 5.0, which is supposed to connect more to human aspects. How Ideas is contemplating to build this into your product? Thank you for the question, Prakash. In fact, we are, what we have realized that it is not more than doing something new, is first of all, do something which we should have always been doing. And that first thing that we are trying to talk about, and we are trying to collaborate with some of our clients in the manufacturing sector, is how do we create greater amount of ownership in people at different levels within a manufacturing setup. And for that, we are looking at one or two tools which we have developed, which we have not discussed in this context. First of all, we are looking at, the understanding people as an individual is very important. The problem is, as you go down the hierarchy, we stop putting in efforts to understand people. I'm sure a manager puts in a lot of effort to understand the direct reportee of his sales team much more than the person who's the office boy, and this manager is the head of the office. So the idea is that how do you value each individual in your organization by understanding that individual first, looking at what could be their motivational triggers to do better than what the person is doing. And here, one of the areas that we have found is a big area of work is the person at the lowest level of hierarchy does not know how is whatever he or she is doing is contributing to the overall organizational goal. There is no understanding in terms of the goals of the organization and how do I play a role in that. And this enhancement of the self-worth by attaching to the organizational goals is something which actually motivates people to look at their work more closely. We have come to the end of the discussion. 1 hour flew past us. Your concluding comments, Ramesh, and then I'll come to Subrata before I wrap up. Any thoughts?
Yeah. So, I mean, like we said at the beginning of this, a much underrated factor in most corporate setups is individual human behavior, and how can that be used productively and usefully to improve overall performance of the individual first and then the organization later. I think that's the important part. And there's a wealth of research today underlying what we call behavioral economics or behavioral science that can be applied using technology and digital tools. And digital tools, I think, have enabled the use of a lot of these very, very productively. So I think it is on the verge of leading to an entirely new phenomenon, I would say, where you can use the power of digital to enable human change in human behavior in order to get greater performance going.
Subrata, your comments?
Yeah, I agree with Ramesh. I think the ability today to interpret data, both qualitative and quantitative, gives us a much better insight. So in fact, more and more qualitative data today can be managed more professionally and better way to really derive certain decisions and all. So going forward, I think that the core of every decision making, be it a small industry or big industry or government, it has to be something related to behavioral economics. People may always argue about that what would be the correct nomenclature, but the issue is that understanding human behavior, understanding that the incentives for a person to act in a certain way is going to be the way forward. And the sooner or better we started integrating into our system, obviously it will not only help us to achieve something, reduce a lot of transaction costs.
In fact, just to add to what Ramesh and Subrata said, I think we should go back to the drawing board and try and understand each and every person who's working with us from his perspective, his or her motivation. And we should not stop at people who are working as a part of a team within the organization. We must look at the motivation of the individual who is representing a vendor, an individual who is a part of the business consulting team, an individual who is a part of the distribution channel. If we do not understand human motivations at an individual level, I do not think we can harness the collective potential of any group or team. And that is one area where we really want to work together with a lot of organizations and help them to get better results from the existing team. In fact, I have made a request to Subrata offline for one of our clients, which is into the space of coaching aspirants for JEE and NEET. I'm saying that every coaching class is focusing on how to teach you about the subjects. But all of us who have been able to compete successfully in these exams know that apart from the subject knowledge, you need a temperament to perform under stress, under difficult, when your expectations are very high. So is there a way we can measure the competitive quotient of a child? And once we know that, how can we help the child to develop that competitiveness within himself or herself along with the subject knowledge? When both of them combine together, that is when you get somebody like an MS Dhoni or a Virat Kohli who perform under extreme pressures. In fact, they thrive under that because of their competitiveness. Thank you so much to each one of you for having spared time to be with us today. You will be receiving a thank you note from us for attending this session, along with a link where you will get the entire video of the session. Thank you once again. Have a nice evening. All the best. See you next time.
Thank you.
Cheers, everyone. Thanks, everyone.